We'll give the the other council members another minute to join us. We're a little bit after 6 already. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know we have just 2 items on the work session agenda this evening, but I think at least one of them will probably take some time. Let's go ahead and call the Johnston City Council work session number 22-05 to order. Cindy, roll call, please.
Councilmember Cope.
Here.
Evans.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Reddy.
Here.
Burkhart.
Here.
First item on the agenda is observations and consideration for the regional water. Jim, would that be you?
It's gonna be Matt.
Matt.
Okay, can you hear me with this? Is this on?
We
I
can
don't
hear
think
you
it's
now.
on. But
Is it on now? Yeah, okay. So I sent Teresa, Jim, and Cindy this presentation about 4:30, and we'll go through it. It's pretty high level, but I also want to take a chance to field any questions. I've been working on regional water stuff probably since about middle of 2018, just following everything that FCS has been doing. Worked pretty closely with West Des Moines and Urbandale in the micro group as they were trying to flush out various financial implications of different things in the model. So I'm pretty well versed in kind of what's in the from a financial perspective, what's in the regional proposal and kind of how it affects Johnston. There's a lot to the 2080, the 28F. And there's a lot of stuff that's non-financial related that I don't know that I'm the best suited to talk about, but I'm kind of focused on the financial stuff tonight. So that we advance to the next slide. So you might hear me talk about phase 3, phase 4. The phase 3 was the last.
Matt,
Yeah.
we can't see the slides.
The slides.
it's on board docs.
How about now, Mayor?
We can see it, yes. Thank you.
Okay, so phase 3, phase 4. Phase 3 back in 2019, it's what FCS kind of shared with really all of the communities. Yeah, go ahead.
When you say FCS, is that like a financial?
Yeah,
for what you guys-
FCS was the financial consultant. They're based out of Washington. They were originally hired by Des Moines, West Des Moines, and Urbandale, and really their scope does regionalization have an economic benefit to the region? And in 2019 they came back and said yes, and they attempted to quantify that and said if everybody regionalizes, there's about $325 million of savings to the region, as opposed to if Urbandale goes to build its own plant, West Des Moines goes to build its own plant, Des Moines does its own thing. So phase 4, the model was updated February 22nd, 2021, so over a year ago. And since then, the micro group has negotiated certain elements to the current proposal that aren't reflected in there, but I've adjusted for those. And I've noted the 2 important things, and I'll talk a little bit about. There's a lot of acronyms and a lot of terminology that might not be familiar to everybody. Jim, do you have a question? Who's in the micro group? Because that's the group that has been working on this. Yeah. So the micro group, I think, consisted of the general managers from West Des Moines, Urbandale, and Des Moines, and then also one board member from each of those boards. And I think what they were trying to do was hammer out all the deal killers. So all of the things that if those three couldn't agree on some of those items, then it just wasn't going to move forward in any form. And so they got to an agreement. I don't know when the microgroup published that their findings, November of last year. So the two adjustments to the phase 4 model is the joint capital allocated on the base extra capacity method as opposed to the MaxDay Demand. And so base extra capacity is something that is important, and I'll do my best to explain what this means, but it effectively takes the average day consumption of the whole region and it divides it by the max day of the whole region. And it tries to say how much of the assets are on average used every single day of the week. And then how much of the assets are just used during the peak times. And it tries to identify that there's this base that should be allocated just like the variable costs are allocated. And then there's this extra capacity that we've got that is just really for the peaks, and that should be allocated to the MaxDay Demand. And this is important for Johnston because Johnston is the highest peaking community. I mean, you guys have the highest concentration of irrigation. You know, your max day divided by your average day is the highest in the region currently. So then the other adjustment that was made is this growth capital. So a big cost in the regional model is who's going to pay for the new growth, not the existing assets, but new assets that are built for future capacity. In Des Moines, was the opinion that, whoever needs that capacity should pay for that capacity. West Des Moines was very kind of had the opinion that we need to acknowledge that when new assets are built, those assets benefit everybody, whether or not you need them for your growth. And the example that kept getting used was, the flood of '93. If that flood happened again and Fluor was out of commission and Des Moines had to pull from all these other plants, Des Moines would benefit from the fact that we had all these other plants to supply them water. So I did some analysis on if we did 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, and they ended up at 9% would be allocated to MaxDay Demand, 91% would be allocated to the growth communities. So I'll get into kind of how that affects Des Moines. And then the asset transfer discussion, this is what is currently been proposed, but I don't think it's finalized. A lot of this stuff, it depends on who participates. So not every community has signed the resolution of intent to participate. And so there may be communities that are in this analysis that don't participate. And if they don't, then all of the numbers kind of will change accordingly. Okay, so we go to the next slide, Sydney. All right, so yeah, perfect. So the MaxDay Demand, so right now what's built into the model is that Johnston will use 5.81 million gallons per day is your MaxDay Demand, and the region will use 110.26 MGDs, so million gallons per day. So you make up 5.3% of the max day of the peak. From an annual demand perspective, what they have built in for you for the model is 848,000 gallons. So that's 848 million gallons per year, and the region uses 22.4 billion gallons per year. And so that's 3.8%. So those two metrics are kind of the most important metrics to start with. And so right now, what's in the model is that on the average day usage is about 55.8%. So that number is important because what's going to happen on some of these allocations is you're going to take the 5.3 and you're going to multiply that by the 55% and then blend that with the 3.8 on the residual. And so if you go to the next slide, and I know this is very technical, this is very in the weeds, but this is the math behind the allocation. And, they're allocating, 10 to 11 billion dollars worth of costs over the next 40 years based on these numbers. So that 4.4% that's in that fixed percent allocation yep, oops, and I got into Urbandale, but that's not, I should update that. That's to Johnston, I apologize. The number is right, I can guarantee you that. That's the blended number. So then this next list of incremental growth share, the 2024 through 2060, effectively what the model does is says how much more water production do we need over the next period. And it's kind of weird, these first three are kind of grouped together because right now they're trying to plan for the assets that need to be built between now and probably 2035. And so right now they're assuming that Johnston needs 4.7% of the region's growth. So what they do is they say, okay, if the region needs an additional 30 MGDs, how much do we think Johnston needs? And then you take that, you divide those, and then that's the portion of the growth that you'll pay for. And you can see as it goes down, Johnston is expected to continue to grow, but not as fast as some of the other regions. So your allocation of growth. And one of the things that I think is still kind of to be determined is how all of this gets reconciled from one year to the next. So if Johnston's planning one thing for the Northwest annexation and then something else happens and they build the assets for you, you pay for them or help pay for them, what happens if you don't need them? And then somebody else is using them, but you're paying for them. So how does that whole mechanism work so that you're periodically reconciling or redistributing the assets that are needed to the communities? Because right now in the model, based on what you think you need or based on what the model thinks you need, that's how it allocates the cost, and it never comes back and corrects it. So I think that's an important technical piece that needs to get worked out in the discussions over the next 6 months. So, next slide. Okay, so just kind of trying to translate some of this and give you some more orders of magnitude. So the first year O&M, in the region, what's in the model right now is about $38.9 million of fixed and variable operating cost. Johnston would make up about 1.6 million of that. And then I tried to kind of bookend this, so give you the first year and give you the last year. And so the last year, you can see they've got 188 million for the region, and Johnston's cost would be about 6.7 million. But I think what's helpful, at least for me, is to look at the 4.4% fixed, the 3.8% variable. Johnston will pay for 4.2% of the operating cost kind of in the early years. And as you move out in the model, if all of the assumptions hold, the region's going to grow faster than Johnston. So you will pick up a smaller portion of those costs as you move into the future. Then you go to the next slide. And I guess let me just back up. There's three big components of costs in the model. O&M, so operating the existing assets, operating the system. Joint capital, which is this one, which is maintaining the existing assets that are there. So not new production, but just repair, replace, just the upkeep of the existing assets, and then new assets, which is the growth capital. So in year one, for the joint capital, it's about $18.2 million. Johnston would pay about $810,000. for those, which is 4.4%. And then in year 40, it's about 143 million. Johnston would pay 5.4 million. So then the next slide. So the growth capital, this is one that it really ramps up. And, when I was looking at this for other communities, this was a big factor is how fast some of these costs grow. And so for the region, it starts out, $1.2 million, which is relatively modest, about $60,000 for Johnston. But as you can see, as it gets out to year 40, $280 million, which is about 6.2 million. So that cost really, really picks up. But, here more than anywhere, Johnston starts to taper off, at least in the projection model that's out there right now. It doesn't grow as fast as some of the other communities.
Matt, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
That 6.2 is an annual expense. That's not a cumulative expense over 40 years?
Yeah, that's right. That's an annual. That's the cost that's in the model out there. And the one thing that one of my criticisms of just the model in general, it's not a criticism more as it is just a pointing it out, is that, they kind of project water based on population growth, and they just think as more and more people live in the metro, they're going to use more and more water. And you just don't see that. I mean, you can see if you look at Johnston's usage from, you guys have added 200 to 300 customers a year, and your usage has been relatively flat for the last 10 years. So I just, I'll be surprised if it just grows in a linear fashion, the usage. But, some of the costs will continue to grow. And so it's kind of hard. So when you divide that by the total gallons, it's still up there. We'll see the graph here in a minute, but it doesn't look as kind of outlandish as the number does.
I'll trust you.
And when you talk about these assets, are we talking strictly water production assets as opposed to assets that we have in the city?
Yeah. So, I mean,
like our water towers or?
Yeah, your distribution system is yours. And
that's not included in any of
That's
these.
not included in the some of the core distribution mains, depending on where that distribution main gets to the city. Sometimes they run through cities to get to other cities. So there's certain, core distribution mains that are considered part of the supply
system. Okay.
of the system. But once it's hooked up to you, your distribution system is your distribution system. Yep. And your water towers are your water towers. Okay. So then this is, so next slide, sorry. So then this is the total. And so one thing, I'm going to stop here and just kind of explain something that's really important, I think, at least from my perspective is that there's two ways that the M1 manual, which is the book that the American Waterworks uses to allow people to set rates. There's what's called the utility basis method and a cash needs basis method. And so you're more familiar with the cash needs basis method. Like, how much do we need to operate the system, to buy the water, to pay our debt service, and to pay our capital. And so that's what goes into what we use to calculate your rates. So Des Moines Waterworks uses a utility basis method, and the utility basis method is typically used when you have like an investor-owned utility and you're trying to return some rate of return back to the entity who kind of owns the assets, takes on the risk. Like a Mid-America would use a utility basis method to capture their rate of return. So when you use a utility basis method, you don't use debt service and you don't use cash for capital. What you do is you do the O&M, and then you do a return on rate base. So how many assets are out there? what's the return we should get on those assets, and then that generates dollars. And then those dollars need to be used for debt service and for capital. And so in this model, what happens is they generate those returns, and so they've got so much money each year. Well, then they test it against how much do we actually need to pay for O&M and to pay for debt service. And since Des Moines Waterworks has no debt service effectively, they don't need all that money right away. So what you see in the model is this cash flow adjustment, where then they say, okay, we're generating, our revenue requirements are generating too much money. So we need to turn around and give that back to the communities. And they do that in the form of a cash flow adjustment. And so your total gross requirements in year one are about 2.5 million, but then they turn around and they say, okay.
2,050,000, right?
So the year one gross requirements, top one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
So then they turn around and say, okay, we've got 18% too much money coming in from our revenue requirements. We need to turn around and give some of this money back. So the model credits this 454,000. So you've got a kind of a net requirement of 2,050,000.
Okay.
And that fluctuates from one year to the next. And so I'll be really interested. They do this kind of at the very end, but to me, why not do it? Why not sharpen the pencil a little bit more in each category, since different communities are paying different percentages for different things? It would make sense that they get a little bit closer, on the joint capital. And so instead of using just a flat 6%, which is what Des Moines uses right now, should that be a variable? Should that adjust year to year? So you only collect what you need, and then you don't have this huge adjustment at the end. So it's a very technical thing, but I think it's an important thing that I'll be paying attention to as the 2080 kind of gets hammered out. So, but effectively about 4.3%, 4.29% of the regional costs are what Johnston would pay. So if you go to the next slide. So what I tried to do here was, the current projected, it's a difficult number to come up with because, Des Moines, we've been building in 5% rate increases for Des Moines Waterworks. Well, they did a 0% rate increase last year for the city of Johnston. So April 1st, you guys, your thing doesn't change. I don't think 5% is sustainable long-term for you. I mean, their cost of service study that they do every year shows that Johnston's, with storage class, is overpaying. They're over-recovering from from the ratepayer class that you're in. So I just don't think, using 5% out in the future is going to be realistic, because I think they're already over-recovering from you. So
realistic in the sense that it's generating, it doesn't need to go up that fast. It can go up slower.
Yeah. I don't think they have justification to keep doing year over year 5% rate increases. Yeah. So I adjusted it down to 3, more along the lines of general inflation, at least the historical long run average. Sorry. So then what I did is, there's actually 2 lines there, but they converge. And I said, okay, the orange line is the phase 4, is if we just take the phase 4 out of their model, and if I just plot it. And then if I structure a debt payment for the asset buy-in, so I think right now in the current proposal, it has Johnston paying about $8.5 million to at the date of the asset transfer. So that's about 60 cents if you divide it by the current. And if you go to the next tab, these numbers are that graph. So the phase 4 adjusted model, in year 1, Johnston would pay 2.95%. And I left out this 18% adjustment because in some of the analyses I've done where the discussion has been, well, what if Des Moines wrong? What if they have grossly underestimated how much they need to maintain the existing assets? And my answer to that was, well, that 18% would go down until, they kept enough money to do that. So I just left it out for now because I think it's the most conservative. But that 2.95 dollars per 1,000 gallons is, comparable. You're paying $4.59 right now. So that 2.95 doesn't include the adjustment for that cash flow adjustment. And then if I add the 61 cents, which is about $518,000 a year of a debt payment, the projected regional cost would be about $3.56. And so that's about $1.01 lower than you're currently paying.
So Matt, can you just back up a little bit? So
Yep.
the $2.95.
Yep.
So I see that on page 11.
Yep.
Where did you come up with that number?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, there's lots of spreadsheets. And so if you go back up, Cindy, keep going one more. So if you go to this number, that 2,504,593, if you divide that by the average annual demand that's in Johnston for the model, that's what it comes to. It's $2.95. So that's 2.5 million divided by the 848,000 gallons, 48 million gallons.
So that's the,
Yeah, there's nowhere it's the price per gallon.
so you go back to page 4, that annual demand, total demand,
Yeah, yeah.
total annual demand, 848, that number.
Yeah, you take that number, divide it into 2.5 million, and you should get $2.95. Yep.
And what is our current,
The current projected on slide 11, that $4.57 is the current wholesale rate that you pay to Des Moines.
okay.
So, conceivably there's $1
And that's $4.57 per
1,000
per
gallons.
1,000 gallons,
Yep.
okay.
So it's about, in year one, it's about 22%. And then, and then a lot of this depends on what do we plug in for what's Des Moines going to do with their rate. This shows a 3% rate increase. So the $4.57, that whole column is just, you're just growing it at 3%.
So are you projecting a lower rate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard for me to come up with a higher number than I think Johnston's currently over, I don't want to say subsidizing Des Moines, but they're over recovering from you. So,
So maybe you're, okay, perfect, okay.
but
That's helpful.
I think one of the things, and maybe if you just go to the next slide.
Before you move off that slide, Matt,
Yeah.
quick
Yep.
question. The $8.5 million that we would have to pay for the assets,
Yep.
is the 61 cents related to that? Is that each water customer's piece of that here in Johnston?
Yeah. So what I did there, Mayor, was I just took the debt payment and I divided it by the consumption that was being assumed there. So the debt payment, assuming that you borrowed SRF 2% for 20 years, the debt payment's about $519,000. And so then I just divided it by the consumption to convert it into a cost per kgal. And so part of the reason that number goes from 61 cents down to 45 cents is because in the model, it assumes Johnston's usage is going to just go up and up and up. And so that's why it gets cheaper, but it's the same payment stream.
Okay, but it is the payment for that $8.5 million in assets that we would have to purchase.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so I mentioned the Des Moines Waterworks rate increase, or the projections are at 3%. This second bullet, I think is an important to wrap, just conceptually grasp. So right now, when you buy water from Des Moines, you've effectively already sold that gallon because somebody turned on their faucet, which pulled it through their meter, pulls it through your system, pulls it from Des Moines. So the second you sell it, the second you've bought it, you already sold it. And so the cost from Des Moines right now is 100% variable, right? So you only pay for what you buy. But in the regional model, they're allocating these costs, whether you sell the water or not. And so depending on how the 28E gets written and depending on how the fixed cost gets collected from the different communities, you take on more risk in wet years where you don't sell as much water. So your costs are still going to be there, and you might not sell the same quantity of water. So when you divide your annual consumption by your cost of buying water from the region, that number is going to go up and down based on the weather. And I think that's the big win for Des Moines in all of this, is that they're transferring some of that risk. Because right now, they don't know how much water is going to get bought and sold next year. They have to make all these projections, and then they have to set the rates, and they have to hope the rates cover the expenses in a wet year or a dry year, and then adjust accordingly the next year. And now, in the regional model, you guys will assume some of that risk as the city. So I would think that in a dry year, you benefit more. Your cost per thousand are a lot lower. But in a wet year, it's conceivable that your cost per thousand are higher than they even are right now, because you're taking on some of that risk. So that's what that second bullet is, attempting to speak to. So the Des Moines, the third bullet, the Des Moines Waterworks Finance and Audit Committee, they've been exploring a different rate structure for quite a while. Right now, it's 100% fixed nearly, and they're wanting to go to more of a. And they've effectively said, if regionalization doesn't happen, we're changing our rate structure next year. And so they wanted to switch to it this year, and I think they got a lot of feedback from some communities that said, if you want regionalization to continue to happen, this is a terrible time to change this rate structure.
Matt, can I ask you to pause just for a second, though?
Yeah.
That being said, that they want to change that rate structure to kind of lessen their risk, and yet, did I hear you say that in essence, we're being overcharged approximately 18%?
No, the 18% is the FCS model on how it's being calculated in the big regional model, not in their current cost of service.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the last I saw, you guys were at like 107%
Okay.
of your revenue requirements. Yeah, for the city of Johnston.
Right.
But there are communities out there that are like 60% of the costs of service. And so they're trying to use this new rate structure. And there's some question whether they can do it under the current purchase capacity agreements. And so it's, I think I put it on here because there's a lot happening in this whole space on how water rates are set, with or without regional water.
Thank you.
Yep. So I haven't read the whole 2080 yet. So I'll just, I guess, preface it with that. But, in the WRA, they set the budget, they assign you your number divided by 12, and you pay that 1/12 of that every year. And then whatever
every month, you mean?
Every month, sorry. Yep, 1/12 of that every month. And then at the end of the year, they reconcile, what did we budget? What did we actually spend? And did we over or under collect from the cities? And then they credit that back 2 years later. And so this whole mechanism on how the region is going to do that, how much of your cost will be fixed, how much will be a per thousand, how will the credits work if there are any. So all of that has to be worked out yet. And that cash flow adjustment, I talked about in the early years, it's 45 cents to $1.25 per kgal. So that gives you a sense of that $2.95. The 45-cent adjustment is what that 18% is. So, and then this last bullet is another one that's very important to Johnston, because one of the big changes from phase 3 to phase 4 was, well, we just won't build assets for any communities that need more than 2.5 times. We'll just assume everybody can manage within a 2.5 times peak.
Can I put within 40 years?
Well, yeah, it's a
Or
it's a ratio. It's an annual ratio.
Okay.
And so effectively what they're saying is, if you're going to peak at 3 times, we're not going to build you the assets. We're going to expect you to figure out how to get down to 2.5 times. And I think if you look at Johnston historically, 2.5 times, has been a good year. Like, your peak ratio has been a lot higher than that. So
Can you just tell me how you calculate the 2.5? What is that in relation to?
yeah, so if your normal day, say, I think you have 5.8 MGD is like 5.81. If you go back to like the very early slides, there, right there. So your normal, so your max day is 5.82. If you convert the annual demand and divide that by 365,
The 848 number?
the 848 and divide it by 365,
Yep.
you're going to get a number that looks more like, and then divide it by 1,000 again to get it in millions. You might get, let's just call it 2. Or yeah, I'll do
2 point, yeah. In-
So I'm just going to do 848 divided by 360. 2.3. So then do 5.81 divided by 2.3, and that's 2.52. And so they're assuming that you can stay at this 2.5 number. But if you can't, what's the consequences of that? Are there any consequences of that? And if there are financial consequences, there's been a lot of discussion about communities don't want this penalty for peaking. And so one way that they help to manage the peak ratio is to build an ASR. Well, not every community can build an ASR, or there's only so many ASRs, and ASR stands for Aquifer Storage Reserve, where effectively what you do is during the winter, you pull water from the system, you pump it into the ground, and then on your peak days in the summer, instead of pulling from the rest of the system, you pull from that ASR, and then you use that to manage your peaks. So you're not, and Ankeny has them, Waukees building one, West Des Moines has
We could
them.
maybe confiscate those ponds that Urbandale bought from us.
I think those are going to become an asset of the region. But the question is if communities can go build these and manage their peaks that way, where does that leave the communities that can't build them? And is that fair that a community can manage that? And there's a cost to them. You got to treat the water as you pull it out. But that piece of it, I think, is something that everybody should be paying attention to as you go through the negotiations of how are the ASRs being discussed or allowed, or is there approval process from the regional board? All of that kind of thing, because it is a big advantage to have one and to be able to manage your peaks. So, okay. Do you have enough time, David? Do you want me to keep going? All right. Okay, I'm going to go through this quick, and this is important, and It'll probably generate some questions, but I'll just do my best. So right now, the book value of the Des Moines assets are 157 million. And what they've done here is they've assigned the communities that have purchase capacity, they've assigned the purchase capacity value to those communities. The net book value of communities that also have additional capacity is about 29 million. So Altoona was 6 million, Grimes with 8.2, and West Des Moines with 14.9. So total assets is 186 million. And these numbers will certainly change because they're tied to depreciation, and that, you know, they don't reflect, I don't think, Grimes's updates. And so as people update and depreciate their assets, these numbers will certainly be different. But I think from a planning perspective, this gives everybody a sense. So then if we convert those assets into capacity, Des Moines has 119 million gallons per day of capacity. You know, the other communities have 17.5. And so there's 136.5 million gallons per day of capacity in the region. So what they're trying to decide is who's currently using what, and then if we reallocated all these assets based on current ownership and based on wherever we should start, what's the buy-in versus what's the payout for various communities. So then the next slide, this first column is MaxDay Demand. So, and it's a 5-year average based on the last 5 years. So for Johnston, the last 5 years, you've averaged 4.83 million gallons per day. That's been your peak. And the region has been at 104.6. And so then they convert that into dollars based on the weighted average cost of capacity. And you can see that some of those numbers are different, and partly because just of where the book value of Altoona's assets are different than the book value of Des Moines' assets in Grimes and in Polk City. So Johnston's number there is, $6.4 million is effectively what you need to purchase in order to kind of have enough capacity to pay for your current MaxDay Demand. And I think that this number, as we get to September, those numbers, 2022 is going to roll on, and 2017 or 18 or whatever is going to roll off. And so those numbers are going to change a little bit. So then what's left is this 31.88 MGDs. And effectively, what they're trying to do is they say, oh, well, who should we allocate this other 31.88 MGDs to? And if you go to the next page, what they're using is the outlook in the regional growth for the first 5-year period. So that 4.7 kind of ties back to what your 4.7 growth number was. So they're saying, okay, Johnston should buy 4.7% of the additional reserve capacity that's out there. So that's an additional 1.5 MGDs. And so the cost for that is 1.3 million. So that's an additional $2 million. So that's where that $8.5 million numbers comes from. And then your initial capacity in the region would be 6.34 MGDs. And just, to give you some perspective, like if you were going to go build a just call it a 6 million MGD, you'd probably use $7 million as kind of the purchase price, $7 to $8 million if you're going to go build the new capacity. So one way you could look at this is, you're building about $45 million worth of capacity. You're buying it for $8.5 million. So it's a relatively good deal for.
How did you get the 45 million?
Yeah.
So if you talk to a lot of the engineers, will tell you $7 million per million gallons of capacity.
Okay.
So 7 to 8 million. So I just, $7 million times 6 is 42 million. times 8 is 48 million.
Okay.
I had misunderstood your comment about the 6 point, or the, yeah. I
Yeah.
thought we could produce that much
Yeah.
before.
I mean, I think on this whole topic, and if you go back 2 slides, Cindy, one more. Yep. I think that the discussion on this whole topic for Johnston is zero a fair recognition of what Johnston's invested in Des Moines' existing assets, right?
Given that we've been overpaying.
The fact that you've been paying the with storage rate for so many years, I think this is where you would hone in on, okay, of that 111 million that Des Moines paid for and that they have credit for, how much of that did we fund through our rates? I mean, this is where you would, debate that piece of it, I think, if you were trying to, justify the fact that you've paid the with storage rate all these years.
If we potentially took 7% of what we'd been paying, since it was estimated at 107%, we could maybe,
Yeah, I mean, the
Give us
100%,
leverage.
the 107% number is what the most recent cost of service study said that they were over, so I think it would require a lot of additional analysis and just to think through like how to approach that, which we
Okay.
certainly can do if it's something that the city's gonna, go after. So,
Matt, I have a quick question. If you go back to that slide that showed what, the assets. So Johnston has pipe in the ground. We have water towers, but we're given zero credit for that.
yeah, so you're
What
just,
what's the credit that, say, Norwalk has? How,
yeah, so your distribution, all the pipe in the ground that Johnston owns,
uh-huh,
none of that is included. None of the city's assets are included in any of these. So think about it
Okay.
as in terms of distributions, say when they bought purchase capacity, they had a chance to give some capital upfront or pay debt service to help expand Saylorville or expand McMullen.
I see.
And so the credit that they're given is how much money did they give to build McMullen or build Saylorville back in 2006 or previous to
Okay.
that.
And Urbandale has those water pits and all that.
Yeah,
other
and
stuff.
part of Urbandale overinvested in the purchase capacity. They have way more capacity than they actually need. They have 15.3 MGDs and they need like 11-ish, so that's why. And Clive is another one that has a lot more capacity than they need. And so
Okay,
that's, yep.
thank you.
Yep. Okay, I should wrap it up here. Any other questions? I mean, certainly we can, my summary slide, these are very high level. These are planning numbers. They're certainly going to change over the next 6 months as communities decide to participate or not. Johnston starts out paying a higher percentage in the region, and over time, depending on how it grows, will be a little bit lower. The asset transfer framework will change based on the communities that participate. So the timing on when asset transfer happens, or are you going to have to get a loan? Are you going to borrow from Des Moines? Or all of that mechanism is still yet to be determined. I think from Johnston's perspective, the WRA model where people pay a surcharge and it's not debt, but it goes below the line as like an annual capital would probably be the best approach, because then it would have the least impact on your ratepayers, because you wouldn't have to count it in your debt service coverage ratio. It would be a kind of a capital expense over time.
Matt, can I ask 2 questions
Yeah.
real quickly?
Sure.
One of which, is the discussion right now that every community that participates though would pay the same O&M rate? I mean, there's always those variances that you had discussed, but we're not going to have any variance now in that kind of base rate?
Yeah, I wouldn't think about it as a rate.
Okay.
Because it's based on what percentage of the annual demand you make up, what percentage of the MaxDay demand, and then they blend that. And so your rate might be different from Clive's rate because of your peaking factor, because of your relationship of your max day to your average day. But I don't think it could get any more fair or equitable based on like the M1 manual and how those are assigned. So I wouldn't use same rate, but same methodology.
Okay.
Yeah.
My second follow-up question is, are there any communities that you've heard of or worked with that are moving away from being their own independent distributors and would instead utilize this new regional authority to be the water distribution for their community?
Yeah, so there's certainly communities that have done that recently in the past. I think Pleasant Hill it would be the one to look to. I haven't been in discussion with any community that was indicating that was their intent. And it's effectively what you're asking is to go become a total service customer of Des Moines, where you give up your whole distribution center and you just let them kind of operate it. And they set your rates. Yeah, I haven't been in any discussions about that recently.
Well, Matt, thank you very much.
I didn't realize we were done. So I'm looking at page 11 here.
Yeah.
So is this kind of the bottom line page that, going into this thing, my concern was, okay, we're gonna have to find money for this $8.5 million and what are the responsibilities? But it appears that looking at this sheet, our actual rates could be lower than we're currently paying, even accounting for that paying the whatever payment we have to make for the 8.5 million. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would be my expectation that if regional water move forward with the current framework, the cost to buy water from the region would be cheaper than it is the cost from buy from Des Moines Waterworks currently. I hesitate to say your rates will be cheaper because, there's Northwest annexation stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff happening on the water side. But
You're right. That's a good point. So our cost of purchasing water will be lower
yes.
than it has been.
And I would also just remember this idea that if you have to pay for the cost and you don't sell the water, the cost per thousand might be higher than it currently is because you're taking on that risk. But in years of normal consumption or even, drier years, I would think the cost per thousand to the city would be notably lower. I've got 22% in here as kind of the starting spot.
So Jim, as we wrap this up, what is the ask to us right now, and what is the process going forward?
Well, the purpose of tonight's meeting is to get a good background on the financial impact of going to the regional water, and appreciate Matt's help with that and helping us understand that. Certainly there'll be a lot more questions in the future. So what's being asked of us moving forward is the micro group that Matt mentioned, Des Moines Waterworks, West Des Moines Waterworks, and Urbandale have asked for communities to pass a resolution to participate in the creation of the 2080 and 2080F agreements that will be required for us to create this regional entity. And their goal, I believe, is by the end of September for communities working on this agreement would have the work done by that time. And so the follow-up to this is that the next city council meeting will have a resolution that would state that we are interested in working on this and do want to participate in creating the documents that would create this regional water group. And so that will be on the next city council agenda. A part of that is this report that came out in November, and I believe we shared this with the city council either late last year or early this year, but this is important for you all to know, to remind yourselves, or I guess read through it again, to talk about what the proposal is for what the regional water would look like. So what I will do is tomorrow I will send this back out to the group. It's a 44-page report, so I don't feel like I want to give it to you on Thursday before the next council meeting. So I will send it out tomorrow so you have time to review that and ask any questions you may have. And then the intent would be, as I mentioned, at the next city council meeting, we'll consider that document that basically says we're interested in participating and working on that 28E and 28F agreement to create a regional water. And we're not agreeing to it at the next meeting, but we're agreeing to participate in the process. And the actual agreement would be later on in September or October, when all the communities would be asked to adopt the 2080 and 28F agreement.
So,
Jim, real quickly, the process, do we know what that is right now?
There will be a committee that'll be established to, and all the communities that agreed or pass that resolution will be a part of that committee. They'll be working on the agreements going forward, so we'll have a representative that will represent our community.
I have one last question. So there's this, you attached in the work session documents, this Central Iowa Waterworks founding resolution.
Right.
That will be what we'll be voting on next week?
Yes.
Next meeting?
Yeah, something similar to that, right?
Okay. This or something similar, or?
Be similar to with that. That was Des Moines, I think Des Moines that they passed, and so we'll have to put the city of Johnston and our references in there. And that does reference this document in that as well.
So other than referencing, the intent is it would be pretty, almost like verbatim, this resolution.
Correct.
Okay.
We just put that in there just as a sample.
No, that's helpful to
Yeah.
have that, because then that gives us an idea of what we're committing ourselves to, so.
Right.
Are there any other questions for Jim or for Matt?
Thank you, Matt.
Matt,
Appreciate it.
well done.
Okay, well, we do have one other item on the agenda, and that is to discuss the zoning and subdivision regulation code update. And I'm going to assume that David cannot do that in 2 minutes or less? Is that correct, David?
Yeah, I don't need much time, but I need more than 2 minutes, so.
Okay, so we'll pick that up then at the end of the regular council meeting agenda. With that, why don't we go ahead and adjourn the work session and come back into the regular meeting promptly at 7 o'clock, okay? We are adjourned. Thank you.